Ellsworth Raymond Johnson walked down Lenox Avenue like he owned it. In many ways, he did. People called him Bumpy because of a bump on the back of his head from an old fight. But that nickname didn't capture who he really was. He wore expensive suits that fit perfectly. His shoes were always shined. When he passed by, men tipped their hats and women smiled. Some did it out of respect. Others did it out of fear. It was 1926, and Harlem was exploding with music, art, and ideas. Jazz clubs stayed open until sunrise. Poets read their work in crowded cafes. Artists painted murals on building walls. Everyone called it the Harlem Renaissance, a time when black culture was finally getting the respect it deserved. And right in the middle of all this beauty and creativity was Bumpy Johnson, a man who made his living breaking the law. But Bumpy wasn't like other criminals. He carried books in his pockets. He quoted philosophers while collecting protection money. He hosted parties where gangsters and artists drank together. Some people said he had two faces, one for the streets and one for the salons. The truth was more complicated. Bumpy believed that protecting his community sometimes meant breaking the rules that white society had made to keep black people down. Bumpy hadn't always been this way. He grew up in South Carolina, where he learned early that the world wasn't fair. When he moved to Harlem as a teenager, he fell into the street life quickly. By age 20, he was in prison for the first time. That's where everything changed. Most prisoners killed time playing cards or fighting. Bumpy spent his days in the prison library. He read everything he could get his hands on: history, philosophy, poetry, and political theory. He studied Marcus Garvey's ideas about black pride. He read W.E.B. Du Bois on civil rights. He memorized poems by Paul Laurence Dunbar. The guards thought he was crazy, spending all day with his nose in books. But Bumpy was building something in his mind. He was creating a vision of what Harlem could be, a place where black people controlled their own destiny. He learned that power wasn't just about muscles and guns. Real power came from knowledge and strategy. When he got out of prison, he was different. He still knew how to fight, but now he could also think 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He started writing his own poetry during those prison years. The poems were about struggle, about pride, about the pain of being black in America. He filled notebooks with his words. When he got out, he would share those poems with the world. Stephanie St. Clair was already a legend when Bumpy met her. People called her Queenie or Madame St. Clair. She ran the numbers racket in Harlem, an illegal lottery that let poor people bet pennies and dream of winning big. She was fierce, smart, and took no prisoners. She was also one of the few women running her own criminal operation. Queenie needed muscle, and she heard about this young man named Bumpy, who was smart and tough. When they first met in her office above a nightclub, she tested him right away. She asked him questions about politics and history. Most thugs would have stared at her blankly. Bumpy answered every question and asked some of his own. "You read books," she said, surprised. "Every day," Bumpy replied. "I figure if I'm going to break the law, I should understand why the law exists in the first place." Queenie smiled. She hired him on the spot. Over the next few years, Bumpy became her chief enforcer. He collected debts, protected her runners, and dealt with anyone who tried to muscle in on her territory. But he did it with style. He was never cruel for cruelty's sake. He gave people chances to pay what they owed. He built a reputation for being tough, but fair. Working for Queenie taught Bumpy how the real power in Harlem worked. It wasn't about violence. It was about controlling the flow of money and information in the community. On Saturday afternoons, you could find Bumpy in Marcus Garvey Park, sitting at a stone chess table. He'd play anyone who challenged him. Young kids, old men, teachers, hustlers. He almost never lost. People would gather around to watch, amazed at how fast he could think. Chess became Bumpy's trademark. When he sat down to negotiate with rival gangs, he'd often suggest they play chess while they talked. He said it helped him think clearly. But really, it was a power move. Watching him dominate the board reminded people that his mind was as dangerous as his fists. Chess is like life, he'd tell the young guys who wanted to learn. You got to think about what happens 3, 4, 5 moves ahead. You can't just react. You got to have a plan. He taught chess to neighborhood kids for free. Every Sunday morning, a group of boys would meet him at the park for lessons. He was strict but patient. He'd make them think through every move, asking them to explain their strategy. Some of those kids went on to become doctors and lawyers. They always said Bumpy taught them how to think. The chess games became famous throughout Harlem. Even people who didn't know about his criminal activities knew about his chess skills. It gave him respectability. It made him more than just a thug. It made him someone interesting, someone worth knowing. Bumpy kept notebooks everywhere, in his apartment, in his car, at the barbershop. When inspiration hit him, he'd pull out a notebook and start writing. His poems were raw and honest. They talked about the pain of racism, the beauty of black life, and the complicated morality of survival. In 1928, he submitted some poems to Opportunity, a Harlem Renaissance magazine. To his surprise, they published 2 of them. He didn't use his real name. He went by E.R. Raymond. But people who knew him recognized his voice. The poems talked about a man torn between doing right and doing what was necessary. Other poets in Harlem were surprised when they found out Bumpy wrote. Langston Hughes read his work and called it honest street poetry. Some of the more proper intellectuals looked down on it, saying a criminal had no place in the Renaissance. But others defended him. They said Harlem was full of contradictions, and Bumpy represented those contradictions perfectly. Bumpy didn't care much about the controversy. He wrote because he had to, because the words built up inside him until he had to let them out. He'd recite his poems at parties sometimes after everyone had a few drinks. People would get quiet and listen. Even the toughest guys would nod along, recognizing their own struggles in his words. His poetry made him human. It showed that beneath the tough exterior was a man who thought deeply about life and meaning. The first time Bumpy gave away turkeys was in 1927. He'd just made a big score and had money to burn. Thanksgiving was coming, and he knew most families in his neighborhood couldn't afford a proper meal. So he bought 100 turkeys and set up tables on 135th Street. Anyone who needed one could have one, no questions asked. The line stretched around the block. Old women who'd never had a kind word for gangsters blessed him. Single mothers with 3 or 4 kids cried as they took their turkeys. Men who'd lost their jobs during the hard times shook his hand and looked him in the eye with gratitude. After that, it became a tradition. Every Thanksgiving, Bumpy's turkey giveaway was the biggest event in the neighborhood. He'd hand out not just turkeys, but all the fixings: sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, pies. The local papers even covered it, calling him Harlem's Robin Hood. Some people said he only did it for publicity, to clean up his image. But the people who received those turkeys didn't care about his motives. They just knew that when times were hard, Bumpy Johnson made sure they had food on the table. That meant something real. The tradition continued every year, even when Bumpy was in prison. His friends would carry it on in his name. It became such a part of Harlem culture that other numbers runners started doing the same thing, trying to build goodwill in their neighborhoods. Christmas was even bigger than Thanksgiving in Bumpy's world. Every December 24th, he'd rent out a church basement or community hall and throw a massive party for the neighborhood kids. There'd be presents for everyone: toys, clothes, books, whatever the kids needed. He'd hire a band to play music. There'd be food and candy everywhere. Bumpy would dress up in a sharp suit and greet every family personally. He'd get down on one knee to talk to the little kids, asking them what they wanted to be when they grew up. Doctor, one might say. Go for it, Bumpy would tell them. Lawyer, another would say. The world needs more of us in those jobs, he'd respond. Parents appreciated that he never encouraged kids to follow his path. He was honest with them. I did what I had to do, he'd say, but you got options I never had. Take them. The Christmas parties became legendary. People talked about them all year. Kids who grew up in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s remembered Bumpy's Christmas parties their whole lives. For one day a year, poverty and struggle didn't matter. Everyone was welcome, everyone was fed, and everyone got something special. Critics said it was blood money, that his generosity was paid for by illegal gambling and worse. But to the struggling families of Harlem, it was a gift from someone who understood their struggles because he'd lived them too. Mrs. Washington ran a small school out of her brownstone on 139th Street. She taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to kids whose parents couldn't afford regular school supplies. One day in 1929, Bumpy showed up at her door with an envelope full of cash. "What's this for?" she asked, suspicious. "Books," Bumpy said simply. "Every kid needs good books." From then on, Bumpy quietly funded several teachers and small schools throughout Harlem. He paid for textbooks, pencils, paper, and desks. He never made a big show of it. Most of the time, the teachers didn't even know where the money came from. Bumpy would have someone deliver it anonymously, but word got around. Teachers started coming to him directly, asking for help. He'd interview them like a banker reviewing a loan application. What were they teaching? Why did it matter? What would the kids learn? If he liked their answers, he'd fund them. If he didn't, he'd send them away. He had one rule. The teachers had to be honest with the kids about the world. No sugarcoating racism. No pretending that being black in America was easy. But also no giving up hope. He wanted kids to understand the challenges they'd face and believe they could overcome them. Some of those kids went on to become leaders in the civil rights movement. They never forgot that their education was partly funded by a gangster who believed in them. The Cotton Club was Harlem's most famous nightclub, but it had a dirty secret. Only white people could sit in the audience. Black entertainers like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway performed, but black customers weren't welcome. It made Bumpy's blood boil. He went there anyway because he had connections. The white mobsters who owned the place gave him a special table in the back. He'd sit there in his perfect suit, smoking cigars and watching the shows. Sometimes he'd bring black friends with him, daring the owners to say something. They never did. After the shows, Bumpy would meet the performers in the back rooms. He became friends with many of them. He'd listen to their complaints about low pay and unfair treatment. Sometimes he'd help negotiate better deals for them. The white owners didn't want trouble with Bumpy, so they'd usually give in. Duke Ellington appreciated Bumpy's support. They'd sit together after shows, talking about music and philosophy. Duke was surprised to find that this gangster understood art and beauty. They became genuine friends, two men from very different worlds who found common ground. The Cotton Club represented everything Bumpy hated about America. Black talent being exploited by white businessmen. But it also showed him the power of black art. When he heard that music, he knew that no matter what white society did, they couldn't kill the black spirit. Billie Holiday was just starting out when Bumpy met her. She was singing in small clubs, still finding her voice. Her life was hard. She'd grown up in poverty and faced constant racism and sexism. But when she sang, everyone stopped to listen. Bumpy heard her perform one night and was blown away. After the show, he introduced himself. "You're going to be a star," he told her. She laughed. "Everyone says that." "I know it," he replied. They became close friends. Bumpy looked out for her like a big brother. When club owners tried to cheat her on payments, he'd show up and have a talk with them. Suddenly, Billie would get every penny she was owed. When men bothered her, Bumpy made sure they stopped. She called him her protector. They'd sit in diners after her shows, drinking coffee and talking until dawn. Billie would tell him about her dreams of making records and performing in big theaters. Bumpy would share his poems with her. Sometimes she'd suggest ways to improve them. "You got talent," she'd say, "but you're trying too hard to sound fancy. Just say what you feel." Their friendship showed another side of Bumpy. He genuinely appreciated art and artists. He wasn't just using them for status. He loved the music, the poetry, the creativity that filled Harlem. He saw himself as part of that world, even if he made his living on the wrong side of the law. In 1930, a white gangster named Dutch Schultz decided he wanted to control Harlem's numbers racket. He figured the black operators wouldn't be able to fight back against his organization. He was wrong. Schultz started by offering to protect numbers runners for a huge cut of their profits. When they refused, his men would beat them up or destroy their businesses. He thought he could intimidate everyone into submission. He didn't count on Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie St. Clair. Bumpy saw this as more than just a business dispute. This was about whether Harlem would control its own economy or be colonized by outside forces. If Schultz won, all the money from the numbers would flow out of the community. Black businesses would suffer. White gangsters would get rich off black poverty. "We fight," Bumpy told Queenie. "This is about more than money. This is about dignity." So the war began. It was brutal and bloody. Men died on both sides. The police, mostly on Schultz's payroll, arrested Bumpy's people while ignoring Schultz's crimes. But Bumpy had something Schultz didn't: the community's support. People warned him when Schultz's men were coming. They hid his runners. They refused to cooperate with the police. The war raged for months, and Bumpy's strategic mind was put to the test. This wasn't just about fighting, it was about survival. Bumpy knew he couldn't win a straight-up fight against Dutch Schultz. Schultz had more men, more guns, and the police on his side. So Bumpy had to think like a chess player. He had to use strategy, not just strength. First, he made sure Schultz couldn't find him. He moved between safe houses every night. He never followed a pattern. When he did meet with his people, it was always in unexpected places: a different church basement, a different park bench, always somewhere new. Second, he hit Schultz where it hurt: his money. Bumpy's people started disrupting Schultz's other operations around the city. If Schultz was going to make Harlem expensive, Bumpy would make everything expensive. Suddenly, Schultz was fighting fires on multiple fronts. Third, and most cleverly, Bumpy reached out to other Italian mobsters who didn't like Schultz. He sent messages to Lucky Luciano, offering to work together. Schultz is causing chaos, Bumpy argued. Chaos is bad for everyone's business. Help me get rid of him, and we can all make money peacefully. Luciano listened. He didn't necessarily care about Harlem's black community, but he did care about stability and profits. A war in Harlem was making everyone nervous. Maybe, Luciano thought, it was time to bring Schultz to heel. Bumpy's strategy was working. Instead of just fighting, he was building alliances and making Schultz's position untenable. It was chess on a grand scale. The meeting happened in a neutral Italian restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Lucky Luciano sat on one side of the table. Bumpy Johnson sat on the other. Armed men from both sides watched carefully, ready for trouble. "You got guts coming here," Luciano said. "You got good sense agreeing to meet," Bumpy replied. They talked for hours. Bumpy laid out his proposal. The numbers racket in Harlem would continue, but it would be regulated. Black operators like Queenie would run the street-level operations. Luciano's organization would handle protection and high-level coordination. Profits would be split fairly. Most importantly, Schultz would be out. Luciano was impressed. This wasn't some street thug begging for mercy. This was a businessman proposing a partnership. "What's in it for me?" Luciano asked. "Peace," Bumpy said. "And steady money. War costs everyone. Peace makes everyone rich." Luciano agreed to think about it. Over the next few weeks, he consulted with other mob bosses. They all agreed that Schultz was too violent, too unpredictable. He was making the authorities pay attention, which was bad for business everywhere. Finally, Luciano sent word to Bumpy. "We got a deal, but you step out of line and this ends badly for you." "Same to you," Bumpy replied. The alliance changed everything. Schultz suddenly found himself isolated. Even his own people started questioning whether fighting for Harlem was worth it. Within months, he withdrew. The war was over and Bumpy had won by thinking, not fighting. When word spread that Bumpy had beaten Dutch Schultz and made a deal with Lucky Luciano, his reputation exploded. He wasn't just another street criminal anymore. He was a power player, someone who sat at tables with the biggest mobsters in America and held his own. But what mattered more to Bumpy was what it meant for Harlem. The numbers rackets stayed in black hands. Money that would have gone to white gangsters stayed in the community. Numbers runners could work without fear. The local economy stabilized. Queenie threw a huge party to celebrate. Everyone who mattered in Harlem was there. Criminals, yes, but also musicians, poets, business owners, and community leaders. They all understood what Bumpy had accomplished. He'd protected their neighborhood from outside exploitation. At the party, a young poet stood up and read a poem about Bumpy, comparing him to ancient warriors who defended their people. Bumpy was embarrassed but pleased. This was what he wanted: to be seen not just as a criminal, but as a protector. Some people still criticized him. Ministers preached against him. Newspapers called him a menace. But in the streets of Harlem, people knew the truth. When it mattered, when an outside force tried to take over, Bumpy Johnson had stood up and fought back. That night, standing in a room full of people who respected him, Bumpy felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not in the violence, not in the criminal life, but in protecting something he loved. Helen Lawrenson was everything Bumpy wasn't supposed to want. She was white, educated, wealthy, and worked as an editor at Vanity Fair magazine. They met at a party in 1932, and the attraction was immediate and dangerous. Their affair was scandalous. In 1930s America, interracial relationships were taboo, sometimes even illegal. But Helen didn't care about society's rules, and neither did Bumpy. They'd meet secretly in apartments across the city, talking for hours about politics, literature, and art. Helen was fascinated by Bumpy's contradictions. "You're a criminal who quotes Plato," she'd say. "How does that work?" Bumpy would laugh. Plato lived in a corrupt society too. He understood that sometimes the law and justice are different things. Through Helen, Bumpy got glimpses into white high society. She'd tell him about parties with famous writers and politicians, about the hypocrisy of people who preached equality but practiced discrimination. It confirmed what Bumpy already knew. The system was rigged, and almost everyone was playing their own angle. Their relationship couldn't last. The social pressure was too great, the risks too high. Eventually, they drifted apart, though they remained friends. But for a brief time, Bumpy Johnson, the gangster from Harlem, and Helen Lawrenson, the Vanity Fair editor, shared something real. It showed that Bumpy could move between worlds, the criminal underworld, the artistic scene, and even the edges of white high society. He was more complex than any simple label could capture. In 1940, a skinny, red-haired teenager started working the streets of Harlem. He called himself Detroit Red, and he was running small hustles, trying to make a name for himself. His real name was Malcolm Little, though the world would later know him as Malcolm X. Bumpy noticed the kid. He was smart, quick, and fearless, sometimes too fearless. One night, Bumpy pulled him aside. "You're going to get yourself killed," he said. "Slow down. Think before you act." Malcolm was defensive at first. Who was this old-timer to tell him what to do? But as they talked, Malcolm realized Bumpy was different. He wasn't trying to use him or exploit him. He was genuinely trying to help. They became friends, in their way. Bumpy would buy Malcolm meals and give him advice. "You got potential," Bumpy told him. "But you're wasting it on small-time stuff. Use that brain of yours for something bigger." Malcolm listened sometimes, but he was young and wild, and eventually he got arrested and sent to prison. Bumpy wasn't surprised. Prison might be the best thing for him, he told friends. He'll either come out worse or come out transformed. I'm betting on transformed. Years later, when Malcolm emerged from prison as a changed man, a disciplined member of the Nation of Islam, Bumpy followed his rise with pride. "I knew it," he'd say. "I knew that kid had it in him." Their friendship would become important again later, during Malcolm's most dangerous days. Sugar Ray Robinson was the best boxer in the world, and he knew it. He was flashy, confident, and beloved in Harlem. He was also Bumpy's friend. They met in a gym where Bumpy sometimes trained to stay in shape. Sugar Ray was impressed that this street guy could actually box. They started sparring together, and a friendship grew. Sugar Ray appreciated that Bumpy never asked him for anything, never tried to use his fame for anything. Bumpy would go to Sugar Ray's fights, sitting ringside in his best suit. After victories, they'd celebrate together at the Apollo Theater or the Savoy Ballroom. They'd talk about discipline, strategy, and the mental game, whether in boxing or in life. "Boxing is like what you do," Sugar Ray once said. "It's about reading your opponent, finding their weakness, waiting for the right moment to strike." "Except when I hit someone, they don't get back up," Bumpy replied with a dark smile. Their friendship showed yet another dimension of Bumpy's life. He wasn't just connected to criminals and artists, he was also tight with athletes and celebrities. He moved through Harlem like a mayor, knowing everyone who mattered and being known by everyone. Sugar Ray never judged Bumpy for his criminal life. He understood that everyone in Harlem was doing what they had to do to survive and thrive in a world that didn't want to see black people succeed. They were all fighting different battles in the same war. Lena Horne had the kind of beauty and talent that should have made her the biggest star in America. But this was the 1930s and 40s, and Hollywood had strict limits on what roles black women could play. It infuriated Bumpy every time he thought about it. They met through mutual friends in the music scene. Lena was frustrated, talking about another role she'd lost because of her race. Bumpy listened quietly, then said, "One day, things will change. Your talent is too big to stay hidden." "Easy for you to say," Lena replied. "You're not trying to make it in a white man's industry." "Aren't I?" Bumpy asked. "I work with white mobsters every day. I gotta be twice as smart and twice as tough just to keep what's mine. We're both fighting the same fight, just on different stages." Lena appreciated his perspective. They became friends, and Bumpy made sure she was protected when she performed in Harlem. If club owners tried to cheat her, they'd hear from Bumpy. If drunks got too aggressive, Bumpy's men would escort them out. Lena would later say that Bumpy was one of the few men in her life who supported her career without trying to control it or take advantage. He genuinely wanted to see her succeed on her own terms. Their friendship represented the close ties between Harlem's underworld and its cultural elite. They weren't separate spheres. They were interconnected parts of the same community. When World War II came, Bumpy was too old to enlist, but the war changed Harlem anyway. Young men shipped out to fight. Women took factory jobs. The community pulled together in new ways. Bumpy adapted. He started black market operations, selling rationed goods to people who couldn't get them legally. Some people called it unpatriotic. Bumpy called it practical. "The government rations food, but they don't ration poverty," he'd say. "People still gotta eat." He was careful to keep prices fair. This wasn't about gouging desperate people. It was about providing a service. He sold sugar, butter, meat, and gasoline to families who needed them. He made a profit, but not an outrageous one. The war also brought new opportunities. With so many men gone, the numbers business boomed. People looking for hope in dark times would bet on anything. Bumpy's operations expanded significantly. But the war also made him think. Black soldiers were fighting for freedom overseas while facing discrimination at home. It seemed like a cruel joke. He started giving money to organizations that were fighting for civil rights. He did it quietly, anonymously, but he did it. "When these boys come home," he told friends, "things are going to have to change. They're not going to accept the old ways anymore. We gotta be ready for that." He was right. The war would plant seeds of change that would eventually grow into the civil rights movement. In 1951, Bumpy's luck ran out. Federal agents had been building a case against him for months. They got him on narcotics charges. He was sentenced to 15 years. Prison was harder this time. He was older, in his early 50s. His body ached in ways it never had before, but his mind was still sharp. Once again, he turned to books. He read everything about the changing world outside. He studied the early civil rights movement. He read about Gandhi's nonviolent resistance in India. He followed the growing tensions in Africa as countries fought for independence. He saw patterns. Oppressed people everywhere were standing up. He wrote constantly, poems, essays, letters to friends. He described prison life with brutal honesty, but also found moments of beauty and humanity. Some of his fellow inmates became his students. He taught them to read, to think critically, to see beyond their circumstances. "You're all going to get out someday," he'd tell them. "Question is, are you going to come out the same fool who came in, or are you going to be someone better?" The years dragged on. Outside, Harlem was changing. The Renaissance was over, replaced by harder times. But Bumpy kept his mind active, kept planning for his return. He knew that when he got out, the world would be different. He needed to be ready. Prison taught him patience. It taught him that sometimes survival was victory enough. When Bumpy was released in 1963, Harlem had transformed. The optimism of the Renaissance was gone, replaced by frustration and anger. Urban renewal projects had destroyed neighborhoods. Drugs were flooding the streets. Young people were angry, and they had every right to be. Bumpy walked streets that looked familiar but felt different. Old friends were gone, some dead, some moved away, some still locked up. New players had taken over his old territories. He had to start from scratch, but people still remembered him. The old-timers talked about how he'd fought Dutch Schultz, how he'd kept the neighborhood together during hard times. That reputation mattered. Within months, Bumpy was rebuilding his operations. The numbers racket was still going strong, and Bumpy quickly became a major player again. But he also saw the heroin epidemic destroying the community. He'd been charged with narcotics before, but he'd always claimed the charges were false. Now, facing a changed world, he made harder choices. Some people say Bumpy got involved in the heroin trade. Others say he never did. The truth is probably complicated. He might have touched it but regretted it, or he might have just been in the world where it existed without directly trafficking. What's certain is that he saw what drugs did to Harlem, and it troubled him deeply. He was older now, more reflective. He wondered if all his years of fighting had actually made things better or just maintained a bad system. In 1963, Malcolm X was the most controversial black leader in America. He'd broken with the Nation of Islam and was starting his own organization, and he was receiving death threats constantly. Malcolm and Bumpy reconnected. They'd kept in touch over the years through letters, but now they met face to face. Malcolm had grown into a powerful speaker and thinker. Bumpy was proud of him, but worried for his safety. "They're going to kill me," Malcolm said matter-of-factly. "The Nation, the FBI, maybe both. I've made too many enemies." "Then you need protection," Bumpy replied. Malcolm shook his head. "I don't want bodyguards. I need to be accessible to the people." "You're no good to the people dead," Bumpy argued. "Let me put some of my best men around you. They'll be invisible until you need them." Eventually, Malcolm agreed. Bumpy assigned several trusted men to watch Malcolm's house, to attend his speeches, to look out for threats. It wasn't enough, of course. When powerful forces want someone dead, it's hard to stop them. But Bumpy tried. Their friendship in these final years was meaningful to both of them. Malcolm represented the intellectual, principled activist. Bumpy represented the street pragmatist. They were two different approaches to the same goal: protecting and uplifting black people. When Malcolm was assassinated in February 1965, Bumpy took it hard. He felt like he'd failed his friend. In his final years, Bumpy became almost mythical in Harlem. People called him the Godfather of Harlem, long before the movie made that term famous. He was the man you went to when you had a problem the law couldn't or wouldn't solve. Young guys in the neighborhood would seek him out for advice. He'd hold court at a table in Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, drinking coffee and talking about life. He was generous with his wisdom, if not always with his money. "Think long term," he'd tell them. "Don't just hustle for today. Build something that lasts. And for God's sake, stay away from heroin. That stuff is poison." He still gave away turkeys at Thanksgiving, though his health was failing. He still funded schools and paid for kids' educations. He still played chess in the park on nice days, though he moved slower now. People would point him out to their children. "That's Bumpy Johnson. He's a complicated man, but when times were hardest, he was there for this neighborhood." It wasn't exactly praise, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was recognition of a complicated truth. Bumpy knew his time was running out. His heart was bad. His body was worn down from decades of stress and violence. But he'd lived on his own terms, and he'd tried in his own way to make Harlem better. Not everyone would remember him kindly, but some would, and that would have to be enough. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson sat down for a game of chess at Wells Restaurant. It was a warm evening, and he was in good spirits. He was playing against a young hotshot who thought he could beat the old man. Bumpy was winning, as usual. He'd just put his opponent in a difficult position when he suddenly grabbed his chest. His face twisted in pain. He tried to speak but couldn't. Then he collapsed forward, knocking the chess pieces off the board. People rushed to help, but it was too late. Bumpy Johnson died there in the restaurant, surrounded by the neighborhood he'd spent his life protecting and exploiting. He was 62 years old. The news spread through Harlem like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew. The Godfather of Harlem was gone. Older folks cried, remembering the Thanksgiving turkeys and Christmas parties. Younger people who'd heard the stories felt like they'd lost a connection to a legendary past. His funeral was huge. Criminals came, obviously, but so did legitimate business owners, artists, teachers, and community leaders. It was a reflection of how he'd moved through different worlds. The church was packed, with people standing in the back and spilling out onto the street. Preachers who'd condemned him in life now spoke carefully about a complicated man who loved his community. It was a diplomat's eulogy, trying not to praise crime while acknowledging the good he'd done. As they carried his casket out, someone started playing jazz. It seemed appropriate. Bumpy had lived a jazz life. Improvised, passionate, sometimes discordant, but always uniquely his own. Among Bumpy's belongings, his family found boxes of notebooks filled with poems, essays, and observations about life. Some of it was published in small magazines during the Harlem Renaissance. Much of it had never been shared. Reading through his work, you could see the mind of a man wrestling with big questions. He wrote about justice and law, asking whether they were the same thing. He wrote about poverty and crime, exploring the connections between them. He wrote about race, about power, about love and loss. His poetry was rough but honest. It didn't have the polish of Langston Hughes or Countee Cullen, but it had something they sometimes lacked, the unfiltered voice of the street. He wrote about things he'd seen and done, not things he'd imagined from a distance. One poem, found after his death, seemed to sum up his philosophy. They write their laws in marble halls, while we write ours in blood. They speak of justice blind and fair. We know justice sees color, so we make our own. It wasn't pretty, but it was true to his experience. Bumpy had lived in a world where official justice was a joke, where black people couldn't expect fair treatment from the law. So he'd created his own version of order, his own system of rules and consequences. His intellectual legacy challenges us to think about what we do when society's institutions fail us. Sometimes the answer is to build alternative institutions, even illegal ones. Looking back at Bumpy's life, one theme stands out. He saw himself as a protector of his community, even when that meant breaking the law. When Dutch Schultz tried to take over Harlem's numbers racket, Bumpy didn't fight just for money. He fought to keep black businesses independent, to prevent outside exploitation. When he fed families at Thanksgiving or gave gifts at Christmas, he wasn't just showing off. He was filling a gap left by an indifferent government and a discriminatory economy. When he paid for children's education or protected artists from exploitation, he was investing in Harlem's future. He understood that a community needed more than just economic survival. It needed culture, beauty, and hope. This doesn't make his criminal activities right. Breaking the law has consequences, both for society and for the individuals involved. But it does make his story more complex than a simple tale of good versus evil. Bumpy operated in a world where official institutions, police, courts, banks, schools, often worked against black people rather than for them. In that context, his alternative institutions, even though illegal, served a real purpose. Modern scholars studying the Harlem Renaissance are increasingly interested in figures like Bumpy. They show that the Renaissance wasn't just about art in galleries and poems in magazines. It was also about survival, about building community in the face of oppression, about using whatever tools were available, legal or not, to create a better life. So how do we understand a man with two faces, the violent criminal and the educated philanthropist? Maybe the answer is that both faces were equally real. Bumpy wasn't pretending to be an intellectual. He really did love books, poetry, and ideas. His interest in philosophy wasn't a pose, it was genuine. At the same time, he wasn't pretending to be a criminal. He really did hurt people, broke laws, and profited from illegal activities. The contradiction was the point. Bumpy lived in a contradictory society, one that preached equality while practicing discrimination, that promised justice while delivering oppression. His two faces were a response to that contradictory world. He was a product of his time and place. Born black in early 20th century America, he faced limited options. The legal economy discriminated against him. The political system excluded him. Education was segregated and inadequate. In that context, crime became not just a choice, but one of the few paths to power and respect. At the same time, the Harlem Renaissance showed him that black culture and intellect were worthy of respect. So he embraced both identities, the street and the salon, the muscle and the mind, the criminal and the patron. Understanding Bumpy means accepting that people are complicated, that historical figures don't fit neatly into hero or villain categories. He did harm and he did good, sometimes simultaneously. That's what makes his story fascinating and important. Bumpy Johnson's influence on the Harlem Renaissance is hard to measure precisely, but it was real. He created space for artists to work by protecting them from exploitation and sometimes funding their projects. He connected the cultural elite with the street, ensuring that Harlem Renaissance art remained connected to the community it represented. His parties brought together people from different worlds: criminals, musicians, poets, business owners, and athletes. These connections fostered collaborations and friendships that might not have happened otherwise. When Billie Holiday sang and Bumpy's friends listened, when Langston Hughes read poetry at a party where gangsters mixed with intellectuals, something unique was happening. He also represented a truth about the Harlem Renaissance that some preferred to ignore. It existed in a rough, sometimes violent world. The beautiful art emerged not from ivory towers, but from streets where people struggled for survival. Bumpy embodied that tension. His story has inspired countless books, movies, and TV shows. The image of the educated gangster, the criminal with a code, the tough guy who loves poetry, these tropes can all be traced back, at least in part, to Bumpy Johnson. He showed that the Renaissance wasn't just about art separated from life. It was about art embedded in life, including the darker parts. The creativity flourished not despite the challenges Black people faced, but sometimes because of them, and sometimes with the help of complicated figures like Bumpy. What can we learn from Bumpy Johnson's life? The lessons are complex and sometimes contradictory, like the man himself. First, there's the power of education. Bumpy transformed himself through reading and learning. Prison could have just been lost time, but he made it educational time. That intellectual foundation made him different from other criminals and gave him tools for strategy and leadership. Second, there's the importance of community. Bumpy understood that individual success meant nothing if the community was failing. His philanthropy wasn't just guilt money, it was investment in the neighborhood he loved. Third, there's the danger of romanticizing criminal life. Bumpy's story is interesting, but it shouldn't be mistaken for a how-to guide. Crime hurt people, destroyed families, and perpetuated cycles of poverty and violence. For every Bumpy who became a legendary figure, there were hundreds who died young or spent their lives in prison. Fourth, there's a warning about systems that push people into crime. When legitimate opportunities are blocked by racism and discrimination, some people will find illegitimate opportunities. The solution isn't to celebrate the criminals, but to fix the systems that create them. Finally, there's a reminder that people are complicated. History's most interesting figures are rarely pure heroes or pure villains. They're mixtures, like all of us, trying to navigate impossible circumstances and make the best of limited options. Today, more than 50 years after his death, Bumpy Johnson remains a legendary figure in Harlem. Old-timers still tell stories about him. Historians study his role in the Harlem Renaissance and in organized crime. Filmmakers create dramatized versions of his life. The apartment building where he lived on West 139th Street still stands. Sometimes tourists come by looking for a piece of that legendary past. The streets where he walked, the restaurants where he held court, the parks where he played chess, they're all still there, though the neighborhood has changed dramatically. His grave in Woodlawn Cemetery gets visitors year-round. People leave flowers, coins, and sometimes little notes. "Thanks for the turkey dinners," one note read. "You helped my grandmother when no one else would." The legend has grown larger than the man ever was. Some stories about him are true. Others are exaggerated. Some might be completely made up. That's how legends work. The truth gets mixed with mythology until it's hard to separate them. But beneath the legend was a real person. Complicated, flawed, sometimes violent, sometimes generous, always thinking, always trying to protect his community in the only ways he knew how. He was a product of his time who helped shape that time. He was a criminal who loved poetry. He was a fighter who played chess. He was a man with two faces, both of them real. That's the story of Bumpy Johnson, the godfather of Harlem, the gangster poet, the protector and predator, the man who lived on the edge between the underworld and the Renaissance, belonging fully to neither and somehow essential to both.